Hello, Professor Davis here, and I am doing another chapter walkthrough from our Fluency textbook, this time in chapter 4, which is the first of two chapters specifically focused on web design. Technically 3 chapters, because actually chapter 6 is a debugging chapter as well. So I'm going to go through chapter 4 in this video. So chapter 3, and also cover this in our class, was about networking. And then I had a separate lecture where I kind of made a bridge between networking and web design, web hosting, etc. All right, so walking through chapter 4. Again, what's our mantra? The whole chapter is important. But I just want to kind of guide you through some things. All right, so first, starting on page, in the 7th edition, on page 77, if you're in a different edition, page numbers may vary slightly. Okay, so the first thing starts by introducing HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. And as I say in class, this is not a programming language. Programming languages have the ability to compute things, to grab data from someplace and bring it in, and to create or write HTML. Programming languages can do that. Markup language shows what content is on the page. So it contains links to images, it contains paragraphs and the text, headings, things like that, and generally how the page should look, although we'll see with CSS that you can make radical changes to even the same HTML page just by changing the CSS. But generally, a markup language, and specifically HTML, shows what the content is that's going to appear on the page. So the construct of HTML is written in what are called tags. So these are enclosed in angle brackets. So you have something in between those brackets. There's set tags that you can use. So there's a list of tags that are actually HTML tags. So not the kind of thing you can make up, but you can choose from the list of tags and use them freely. So something I have you guys do in class. I know this sounds corny, but just trust me. We're going to say this together. The tag opens and the tag closes. Say it one more time. The tag opens and the tag closes. All right, so that is, again, page 77. The concept is that these tags, with only a very few exceptions, have an opening tag and a closing tag. If you forget to close a tag, then the web browser that reads that page is going to interpret it as continuing all the way down the page. So that's why it's so important to remember that they have an opening and a closing tag. So that's going to be easier for you to see when you're actually reading the book, and then in the videos where I actually walk you through creating a website from start to finish, we go over it as well. But for now, it's important to remember that expression. So I make students repeat it because I used to, my first few times teaching web design class, people were always leaving their tags unclosed. Ever since I started making you say that, the grades went up and tags got closed. So that's why we do it. There are, on page 78, a couple of those exceptions. In fact, the 2 listed here are the ones that we come across in class. There's the horizontal rule, which is not always used anymore, but sometimes it's still helpful, and that just puts like an actual visual line across that divides the page. And then a line break, which is akin to clicking Shift Enter in Microsoft Word or several other programs, where instead of going down to a whole new paragraph, you just move to the next line. So there's that line break. Couple of others, those are most of the ones that we'll see, and so that again is page 78. The bottom of page 78 shows the structure that you use to create a website. So you've got a couple tags that are required, and then it introduces the concept of the head and the body. So again, another thing that I cover in class, you have a website has a head, it has a body. Everything belongs either in the head or in the body. The things in the head are like links to other files like style sheets, that will affect how the page looks, or the title of the page. A few other things can belong in the head. The body is what contains the things that are actually on the page. So something can go in the head or it can go in the body, but there's nothing between the head and the body. In other words, there is no neck. All right, again, covered in great detail in the textbook here and in my walkthrough of creating a site from start to finish. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This is actually walking through an example, which it does very well. Mentions text editors, and what I like to refer to these, the ones we use in class, I refer to them as color-coded code editors. So unlike a plain text editor like Notepad, that comes with every Windows computer, these color-coded code editors actually let you write in HTML and several other languages as well, and gives you coloring, so it helps you to find problems with the syntax. So syntax refers to the specific way in which a language has to be written. So just like in English, there are certain things that we write in English. We end certain sentences a certain way. We begin sentences with capital letters. There are certain things in each language, each spoken language or written language, that you do. In a similar way, programming languages and markup languages like HTML have a syntax that you have to follow. So for example, you have to use an equal sign in a certain way, or some two spaces don't mean anything different than one space, but you have to use a semicolon at certain times. So syntax is very important to follow. So when you're using a color-coded code editor, it tends to show the page, certain things will always be purple, certain things will always be red. And if you have a problem, like a tag that you forgot to close, or maybe you misspelled a specific tag name, not like spell check, but like a name that programming language or markup language knows, and you spelled it incorrectly, it'll look a little bit different, or something will continue to be bolded when normally it shouldn't be bolded. And so it just helps to kind of draw your eye to errors in the code. In our class, we use Notepad++ on the Windows machines, and Mac students are using Text Wrangler or another program called Atom. Either way, either of those are good. They all work pretty much the same way. And again, they're very helpful when you're actually writing code. Okay, let's see. So skipping ahead, at the bottom of page 81 and going to the top of page 82, talks about the concept of having a folder in which you save your files. So this is another thing that we have to repeat. Okay, I have to repeat. When you're building a website, all of your files need to be kept together inside of one folder. Say it with me. One folder. Okay, so what we do in class, you create a folder first. Call it My Website or something like that. It does not have to be called one folder. Had a few students actually name it one folder. It doesn't have to be called that. Call it My Website, something like that. Best named with all lowercase letters and no spaces. Okay, all lowercase letters, numbers if you need them, underscore if you need them, and a dash or hyphen if you need them. So name the folder and keep all of your files there, okay? Now subfolders are fine. The site we build in class is rather small, and so the one folder is sufficient. Subfolders are fine, but if you have files that are located in some other folder, then you have to write your code in a certain way so they can refer out to that folder, and it makes it hard when you're moving the site from place to place. Another common pitfall is if you don't intentionally create that folder at the beginning, a lot of times students will end up saving their site just in the generic Notepad++ system folder, or maybe it's on the desktop, maybe it's in My Documents. They end up with multiple copies of the same document. Then they end up making changes to the copy that's open in their code editor, and then looking at a different copy of the document in their web browser and wondering why their changes aren't being reflected. And so when we research, we find out that they've got multiple copies of the files. So that's a problem. So again, make that one folder. Make that one folder. Name it something. My site or whatever the top of your site is. Again, avoid capitalization. Do all lettercase, numbers, hyphen, underscore, nothing else, because it just keeps it simpler, and then intentionally place your files inside of that folder. All right, so so that's kind of touched on in part page 82. All right, page 83 starts to introduce the structure of a document, starting with headings. So the possible headings that you can use in HTML are heading 1, heading 2, all the way to heading 6. It's written with a H1, H2, H3, etc. Again, I like to always write all of my tags in lowercase. It won't break if they're capitalized, but just easier to keep everything in lowercase, except for text that needs to appear on the page. That, of course, can be written normally. So so these are the formats that you can use. That's introduced on page 83. So each browser determines what heading 1 looks like in that browser. And with CSS, which we haven't gotten to yet, but eventually we'll get to CSS, and that can be used to change how your headings look. But for now, for your very first approach, it's good to know that you have these headings. H1 is bigger and more dominant on the page, and then they get smaller as they go from there. So headings are not just used for appearance to kind of prioritize text as you would in any written document, but also there's also search engine optimization relevance to them as well. So something that's written in an H1 or H2 text, the search engines will see that as being bold, a priority in that document, and it will rank your site accordingly based on what information is in which headings. So that is also important to consider. Okay, at the bottom of page 83 talks about white space. Again, in HTML, having multiple spaces does not make in your code does not make a difference. Having lines between text or indenting does not make a difference. You should do what makes your code readable, what makes it easy to follow along with what's going on. And then there are different ways you actually create spaces when you need them to appear on the page, whether it's a paragraph or space between text. All right. Okay, page 84 begins the concept of attributes. Okay, so there are tags, and then tags can have attributes. So you have a paragraph. Well, what kind of paragraph? And some of these attributes have to do with CSS and how they're formatted, and some of them have to do with some specific information that's needed. So, for example, an image tag. If you want to place an image on your page, you can say, can I have an image? And so you use the image tag, which is actually just IMG. But then what else does it need to know? Well, it needs to know where that image is located. The actual name of the file needs to know that. You can also specify things like the size of the image, the border of the image. Again, we normally do a lot of that using CSS now, but still, those are still attributes that need to go along with it. So it starts to introduce that concept, which tags have attributes, which ones don't. That is introduced here, starting on page 84. All right. Let's see, accent marks, and so 85 and 86, a few of the special characters and how you designate them. Those are going to be way easier for you to read on the page than for me to say out loud, because it's going to sound weird. But if you do want to create some, you have to use this symbol that starts with an ampersand. It has a semicolon at the end, and there are these set values. Not the kind of thing you bother to memorize unless there's one you use all the time. You can look them up as a chart or anywhere else. Okay, page 87. So this gets into the process of how you create a website, or specifically just one page to start with. So you write some code, save that code, and then you open that page in your web browser and see what the code looks like. And that's how you know you can go back and forth and make changes. Again, the videos I walk you through, you'll see us go back and forth through that process many times. The next time you make a change, instead of reopening that file in the web browser, in which case you have 2 copies of it open, or 2 tabs with it open, or 3 or 4 or 10, instead go back to that tab that you already opened in your web browser, the file you already opened in your web browser, and refresh it. Couple different ways to do refresh. Sometimes the F5 key, sometimes the Control or Command R key, whatever is comfortable for you. Sometimes the little curly arrow. So you refresh that page. So the textbook calls this compose and check. So write code, save, refresh. How's it look? You make changes. You go back and forth. Even as an experienced web developer, there's still a lot of that happens because you look at how the code looks on the page. Like, well, I'd like to change that. I'd like to change the spacing. So this compose and check process continues. No matter how long you're doing web development, you're always, there's always a little bit of back and forth. Sometimes you're using a different kind of web design editor, what they call WYSIWYG editor. What you see is what you get. Those editors sometimes will allow you to see the code as you're writing it, but you still end up wanting to see it in the browser because sometimes there are differences in how it appears in that editor versus how it appears in an actual web browser, depending on the complexity of the site, a few other factors. So that process continues. Also, the next few pages, or next couple pages, 87, 88, talk about the concept of validating, that there are online services that will allow you to validate your code, and that's really making sure that it's compliant with the rules of HTML. So not only that the code works, but is it also properly written? Is it well-written code? So that validation process is covered up to page 89. All right, and then we start with CSS. With CSS, this stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And this is where you can have written in your HTML, you have this as a heading, and this is a paragraph, and here's another heading, and here's another paragraph. Well, CSS determines what that looks like on the page. CSS can be used to position it. I want it to be this far from the top of the page, or this far from other things around it. It controls colors, the color of the text, the background color, the color of any kind of border, the width of those borders, the style, whether a solid line or a dotted line. And that's just a few, just scratching the surface of what you can do with CSS. Again, you can have the same piece of code, the same piece of HTML code written, applying a different style sheet can make that look completely different. So that's pretty exciting, and most of what we do in CSS, or most of what we do on the web in terms of design and appearance, we do with CSS. Okay, so CSS, where can you put the code? So this kind of spans from page 89 to 92. From 89 to 92, where your CSS code can go. So you can have an external style sheet, you can use an embedded style sheet, or you can use inline styles. So an external style sheet, I briefly mentioned when I talked about what things can go in the head section. You can have a whole separate page, styles.css, for example, something.css. And that can list all of the styles for your entire website. And then in the head section of every page, you just have a link to that style sheet. So you're basically saying this page should be presented based on this style sheet right here. So that is how you make a site consistent across all of the pages without having to manually go in and make those same changes to every single page. So an external style sheet is the first method of attaching styles to your document. Second is an embedded style sheet. If you can forgive the gruesome wordplay here, it's embedded in the head. Embed in the head. It's usually always a bad thing. But in terms of CSS, that means that in the head section, you actually have the styles listed. So you use the style tag, tag opens, the tag closes style, and then you just list all of the styles there. Those styles, rather than being visible across all of the site, across all of its pages, those are only going to affect everything on that page, but they will affect everything on the page. So if you have an H1 in your style sheet, you say, okay, all of my H1s, my heading level ones, should all look like this. They should all be red. They should all be underlined. They should all have a dark blue background color, whatever. You can list that in the head section, embed in the head, an embedded style sheet, and then that will affect that entire page. Third way is to use an inline style, and that's right inside of those tags. So we talked a minute ago about attributes. In an inline style, right in that attribute, you can list the style. So you can open a paragraph tag, say paragraph, which is just the letter P, and then you would say style equals, and then inside of quotation marks, you would list background color, font style, any other settings that you wanted to use. You would list right in the style. There are times when all three of those are valuable to use. If you're using all three, so there's a conflict. Let's say you had an H1 in the external style sheet and you had an H1 in your embedded in the head style sheet, and you had an H1 in a local inline style right in your code. The style setting that's closest to the actual content overrules the rest. So something listed in the head section will overrule a style listed in an external style sheet if there's a conflict. Something in the inline style sheet will overrule both the external and the embedded style sheet. And there are times when they're all helpful. I use all three depending on what's going on. But again, if you want something to take effect across more places, you should put it higher. So if you want everything on the page, all heading ones to look the same, put that in as an embedded style sheet so that you don't have to change every single one of them. If you want it to go across multiple documents, make the external style sheet. So again, they're all useful, all relevant techniques, and those are covered or spread out across those pages. Okay, starting in page 93 is where the textbook starts to explain how you connect to other pages. The important thing I want to mention here is the concept of the relative addressing and absolute addressing. So you can have a link, a hyperlink is actually what it's called, to another page that's in your folder. And you can also have hyperlinks out to the rest of the internet. So the way you write those is slightly different. So you are always going to start with the anchor tag, which is just the letter A. And again, this is here on page 93. And then if you are using something in that folder, you can use a relative reference, which you can do with just naming the file, page2.html. And then if you want to go out to the internet, you have to start with whatever the protocol is. So usually that's going to be http://. Nowadays, most sites are using SSL certificates, so they're secure. So you would start with https://. So you have the complete address. If you just started writing www.something or google.com, it would be looking for that as a locally named page in your same folder. Will not work. So you've got to start with the absolute location across the internet, which is that full URL that starts, again, most often with HTTP or HTTPS. So that starts to show here. Again, this is the kind of link that has to have an attribute because you're saying there's a link, which is that A tag. But you also need attributes to show what you're linking to. So that's the hypertext reference. So you have A and then href equals, and then in quotation marks, you list whatever that file name is. There are other things that are also included here, other possible attributes. there are some that will list the title of that site, which is helpful for regular users, but is actually more important even for accessibility, for people who are visually impaired or hearing impaired, and they're using special software to help them navigate the internet. Those extra attributes are actually essential and even required to comply with regulations on accessibility. You also have your, you can also specify whether a page opens, that new page you click, does it open in the same tab that you're already in? Or do you need to open in a new tab? Or do you need all of your links to open in this one other tab? So all of those things, that in that case, that's called a target, is another attribute that you can use. So there are several. W3 Schools is a great site to use to find all possible attributes for any given tag. Again, not the kind of thing you totally try to memorize everything of it, though some will be familiar to you over time. But web design is the kind of thing where you will often use a reference guide like W3 Schools to make sure that you have access to what you need. All right. Also, those code editors we talked about, some of them will also list the tags kind of built in as you're working, so there'll be little pop-ups that come and let you access them more quickly. So that's also helpful. Okay, I already mentioned the image tag when we talked about attributes. The textbook covers that starting on page 93, bottom of 93, and then also moves on to in 94. Additionally, it mentions, as I briefly mentioned, using CSS for positioning content. So here you can use that for, it talks about positioning content with HTML, with a style sheet. So you can use that either to position something to the left or to the right or centered. You can also use styles that will let your content float and kind of wrap around an image. Okay, so that's the float attribute. And then, as extends, talked about images, talked about links, you can actually have an image that is a link. So you can, instead of saying click here with some text, instantly click here is not really a good thing to put on a page, but that's more about usability than anything else. But instead of some text that you want the person to click, you can actually have an image that they would click. So that's covered on page 95. All right, page 96, talks about the relative path that I mentioned a few minutes ago when we first started looking at the references, the links. So that's on page 96. Page 97, this is talking about kind of some of the elements in HTML. So there's the span first, which is used for a stretch of text. Okay, so usually within a paragraph or within a heading or something like that, and just these words, this part of the text that you want to do something special with, that's a span that you're able to use. You can also create lists. We use primarily ordered lists and unordered lists. Ordered lists have either numbers or letters or Roman numerals that, A, B, C, D, or an unordered list is just bullets. And you can customize which numbering system or which order system you want to use, numbers, letters, lowercase, uppercase, Roman numerals, etc. And then unordered lists, you can choose which kind of bullet you want to use. All right, we do not typically use description lists, but they are shown on page 99. So I've been talking about CSS and how you can control things. I just want to mention here, when you're making, I mentioned, if you want all your heading 1s to look like this, you want all your heading 2s to look like this, all your paragraphs to look like this. What if you want some paragraphs to look like this and some other paragraphs to look a different way? That's when you start to use the class or an ID. So you can use an ID if you have a section of the page that should look a certain way, the header, the footer of the actual page as it appears on the screen. And then you can also use a class. So you have maybe some paragraphs are the product descriptions, and they should all have a certain font. But if it's a paragraph that's the information on, the nutritional facts, or how to manage, or how to take care of the the product that's being sold, maybe you want those to be in italics and in a smaller font. So you can use the class to specify how each of your, how class of elements should look on your page. So that would appear in your style sheet as well. All right. I am going to talk about the box model in a different video. So on page 100, they're introducing tables, which are just like they are in Word or anything else, with rows and columns. Just specific code that you use to style them and to make them appear a certain way. And then the box model is really critical. I'm going to cover that separately. So it is listed on page 101. Very important, very helpful. Okay. All right. So page 103. More about cascading style sheets, how you use them. They're introducing, again, the external style sheet that I mentioned, where it's in another file, and just lots more examples of that. So there's the list of, again, which styles kind of override the others on page 104, using classes, as I just mentioned, page 105. Through 106. Pseudo classes. So these are interesting. So a pseudo class is where you can affect, this is page 108. This is where you can affect part of an element. So for example, using the internet, that often you'll see, especially in search engines these days, they're still using it pretty much exclusively. So if there's a link you've never clicked on, those are usually blue. If there's a link you have clicked on, those are normally purple, or a site can change them to be some other color. So that is done using pseudo classes, page 108. So where you see A, again, is a link, a hypertext link to somewhere. And then you can have what do links look like when they've been visited? And then what do links look like when you're hovering over it? So sometimes you'll put your mouse on a computer, you'll put your mouse over a link and it'll go bold or underline or something like that. That's how you can affect that with these pseudo classes. You can also use them to style, like if you've got a paragraph or, a sentence, but in an HTML paragraph, and you want the first letter to look different, or the first line to look different, you can use pseudo classes for that as well. And again, these are set words that you have to use: colon hover, colon visited, colon first hyphen line. So you got to just make sure you're using the right pseudo class, that following the syntax. Hi, helicopter. All right. Okay, page 109 talks about navigation, so specific ways that you can write styles to look like a menu. And then page 110 shows how a gradient can work, that you can actually, instead of having to create an image to show a gradient of color, transitioning from orange to blue, my alma mater colors, that's in the textbook, so transitioning from one color to the next, you can actually use CSS to do that. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter. So again, use this chapter, go through it, take notes, understand it, but then this is the kind of chapter that's used as a reference. So when you get to the point like, wait, I've got a link to write, come here, look at those pages, and you can, refresh your memory, see some of the, whether the attributes or some of the special things you can do. Again, the W3 School Sites is a great comprehensive resource. It covers many languages actually, but specifically for HTML and CSS, for what we're doing in our class, you can use those to understand every possible option of any given tag or any given style. So this is, again, a kind of a reference chapter that once you've read through, you can continue to refer back to. And lots of great and very helpful information as you are creating your first website. So use the textbook information. This video, I hope, is helpful for you, especially for my students who are using it in context with the videos where I walk you through line by line, here's how you build your first website. This is going to be a great resource to make sure you can do the things you want to do. All right, next up will be chapter 4. Sorry, that was chapter 4. Next up will be chapter 5, more of web design. All right, bye.